First Nations leaders, Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples, spiritual leaders, community leaders, executives, First Nations professionals. This presentation will give you a snapshot of what First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, and Indigenous peoples are faced with in Canada. It will give you information in general of the pre-contact, how it used to be. It will give you in general how contact has impacted the First Nations and how it is now in post-contact. The facts are there. The truth of the matter is that the facts are always smokescreened by the governments or the industries. However, the reality is that it is workable by First Nations. The pre-contact, as I mentioned, all First Nations in Canada had principles and still have these principles of trust, respect, sharing, and teaching. These principles, values, were upheld by each individual First Nation citizen. And it was upheld at a community setting, and it was upheld at a nation setting. Language was at 100% fluency. There were additional languages of other First Nations that were taught by other nations so that there could be trade and bartering and there could be understanding with other First Nations. This leads us to nation relationships where trade was very important. First Nations had vibrant economies of renewable resources right across the country. Language was very important to us. It depicted who can trade with which nation. And if you had the ability to talk the other languages of the other First Nations, then you had the ability to trade. Conflicts often happened within a nation or from nation to nation as well. And they were settled immediately. Out of the conflicts were understandings between nations that were created. The understanding of respect, the understanding of trust, and the understanding that trade was very important between nations. Then contact has happened and it has impacted the First Nations immediately. The contact by the industrialized worlds as we know it. First Nations right across Canada refer to them as newcomers. It wasn't until some 250 to 300 years that the contact was made. And when the contact was made, the first intention by the First Nations was to make sure that the visitors were safe, that the visitors were healthy, and that the visitors were fed. On the other hand, the industrialized nations that came to this country, their focus was land and the resources. The government intention, even back then, was to extinguish the Aboriginal peoples, the indigenous peoples, the First Nations that were in the way, that were on the lands and the resources, that they practiced their traditional livelihoods, where they practiced their traditional livelihoods, and where they practiced their spirituality and their well-being. As time came by, as time went by, rather, the government intentions through the federal legislations continued through the Indian Act. It continued into the Indian residential school systems. It continued through the White Paper of 1969. And the intention was to kill the Indian within the child, vice versa as well, to kill the child within the Indian. This act was impacted immediately. The impact was felt by the First Nations immediately through the Indian residential schools. Language was immediately lifted from the First Nations individuals that were put into the school system. Day schools were the same. Catholic schools were the same. Protestant schools were the same. Other religions, all the schools, day schools, had the same intention of ridding of the languages. The Indian Act also resulted in having the Aboriginal peoples, the First Nations, to be moved on to reserve lands. When this occurred, the result was immediate. The results of addictions, the results of health and living in a limited space, the impacts of selfishness, addictions, violence was felt by the First Nations immediately. And the language degradation was immediately felt as well. This moves us into the post-contact today, where First Nations and the modernization or the modernized governments and industry are to coexist. Again, as determined by the governments, again as determined by the industry, to utilize these fancy words to satisfy First Nations, letting them know that to coexist means to talk in a trustworthy manner, to talk in a respectful manner, and to be direct on the facts themselves. And yet, as we all know, the facts of the matter are always not as part of the negotiations. The facts of the matter are land and resources. This leads us into, again, the Indian Act and how government is in total control over the Indian matters. How they are in total control is through the Band Council system that they have imposed onto the reserve lands. Indian Affairs tell the Band Councils what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Through the contribution agreements, they are to spend X amount of dollars at an X amount of time at a zero balance and to submit an audited financial statements to that effect. Cash in, cash out, zero balance. If there should be a surplus, that money comes back to the government. This sort of system has impacted the First Nations at the community level tremendously with phenomenal impacts, such as infighting, family disputes, and selfishness. It's a code of silence that has been with the First Nations for many, many years. And yet, the government and its fancy ways of words, intimidations, their fancy ways of encouraging First Nations leaders, band members, that their way is a better way. And we all know that that is not the truth. Let me bring you back to who is in total control. The government is still in total control over the First Nations or Indian matters. These are the actual and the real truth of the matter. The federal government is in total control. The provincial governments are in total control of the following here in BC. The British Columbia Treaty Commission, for example, is under the auspices of the Indian Act, is under the auspices of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. They provide the money to the people that are working under the BCTC regime. The province are in total control of what is to be in the treaty talks under the BCTC regime. Land claims are in total control of the federal government under the Indian Land Claims Act. Treaties right from 1 through 8 right across the country of Canada is under total control of the Indian Act. Although there are some fancy words that are spelled out by the federal governments in terms of treaties. Are they upheld? Are they honored by the federal government? That remains to be seen. And the First Nations themselves that are under treaties 1 through 8 know if they are upheld totally or not. Leaders, chiefs, band members, citizens, First Nations citizens, we all know the reality sets in when big development starts to happen, such as mining, pipelines, forestry, all of these developments, road construction. All of these developments, when they start to occur, the governments come in and do consultations with the First Nations. The reality sets in for the governments now and the industries now when these big developments happen, and that they have the obligation to talk to First Nations because the world is watching them. The world is watching Canada to see how they treat First Nations, Indigenous peoples, or Aboriginal peoples. As the world watches how they are to consult with the First Nations, within Canada, the consultations are all positional and it's all predetermined by Canada, by the provinces, by the industries themselves. That's the reality. The other side of the reality for First Nations is that there is a way to deal with all of this, and that is a concept of nation building. Nation building is a key to reclaim and to restore your Aboriginal activities, to restore and reclaim your Aboriginal identity, and most importantly, to restore and reclaim your language back to 100%. And your traditional values and principles will be intact for the future generations. Nation building will be key for your people to be aware that they are still withholding the principles and the values of your ancestors. It will also help your people to become active in the areas of commitment, being committed, that they will need to act today. They will need to act today to help one another, to get one another to realize that there is one common and ultimate goal that needs to be achieved today. And that is to reclaim and to restore your identity, your language. Once you have come up to that point in time of awareness, action, commitment, your First Nations and the citizens will be able to tolerate what will be happening within the next year, within the next millennium. And your generations, future generations, will be so thankful to you. It is time now to create history, to make history, as your ancestors have done. You're following in their footsteps. It's time to make it happen.